1968, Rapid City, South Dakota. A 60-year-old woman is brutally raped and killed inside her own home.
They find out not only has she been strangled, but she's been strangled very violently.
The cause of death was strangulation. The manner was a homicide. This was a brutal, vicious murder.
As the case goes cold, the investigation is hit by numerous roadblocks, not least the destruction of evidence.
1972, Rapid City experienced a devastating flood. The basement of the police department was effectively filled in with silt, which thereby destroyed all of the records.
So literally, you're starting back at the beginning again.
All hope of ever finding the murderer is gone until one detective utilizes a new form of investigative science.
Genetic genealogy presented Detective Keith with a brand new tool.
If I were able to match the suspect's DNA to one of these databases, there was no doubt in my mind I could at least come up with who his family members were.
This is the story of Gwen Miller and how, thanks to forensic genealogy, her cold case is finally able to be solved.
It was heartwarming to know that there were people in that community that had worked that hard to try to find the right answer.
Rapid City, a leafy, peaceful community. It's the second most populous city in the state of South Dakota.
Rapid City is just a good quality Midwestern town. Its city is in its name, and it's gotten considerably larger over the past few decades. Generally speaking, the people here, most of them are middle class, hardworking families that just want to go on about their day in peace and quiet and calm.
Rapid City is known for its proximity to Mount Rushmore, so it's like the president's city. And there's this really cool art project where all the presidents are in bronze statues around the city. So they really, really focus on, you know, that presidential look because of Mount Rushmore.
But one day in the late 1960s, the peace and tranquility of this historic place was to be shattered. On February the 29th, 1968, Gwen Miller failed to show up for work.
Gwen Miller was a pharmacist, and she worked at Bennett Clarkson Hospital, which was one of the two main hospitals in Rapid City at that time. And she was known to the people there, the nurses, the doctors, just the general hospital staff. She was known to be a diabetic. And she had, over time, had some diabetic seizures. She had, passed out a few times, things like that. So the staff there was aware of that. It wasn't a huge problem, but they knew that about her. A couple of the nurses that were on staff there were very concerned about her because of her known diabetic status. And the two of them went together to her house on Hall Street to check on her, to find out, what happened? Why is she not here?
What do they find? Broken glass, the door open. So they go in and they look around. And they see Gwen in bed, and they don't think much of it. They think maybe she is in a diabetic shock, coma. But then they look closer and they see, no, she's dead.
Her co-workers immediately called the police, Rapid City Police Department. And when the police arrived, they did a crime scene investigation. They started collecting evidence. They collected Gwen's pajamas. They collected the sheets which were on the bed. They collected her purse, and they collected her checkbook, which was really a strange thing because Gwen kept meticulous notes of all the places that she would go and even the amounts of money that she would spend. If she spent $2.50 on a taxi cab, she would note that in her checkbook, and all the expenditures of her life were there.
When they started looking at the scene a lot closer, the only indication that there was any serious trauma to Gwen at that point in time was some type of a mucus substance like mouth mucus on one spot on the pillow. There wasn't blood that they could find. It wasn't a bloody, gruesome type of scene. They did notice a little bit more about her neck and there being contusions and kind of marks around it that might be consistent with her being strangled.
So the coroner arrives on scene to oversee the body being taken to the pathology department for further forensic examination. But right away on scene, I mean, they can tell that, you know, Gwen Miller has been raped and likely strangled because there's bruises on her neck. When they look deeper at this, they find out not only has she been strangled, but she's been strangled very violently by a strong person. Her ribs are even broken. So what does that tell me? That tells me the person kneeled on her chest while he strangled her to death. And she likely fought after he raped her.
The cause of death was strangulation. The manner was a homicide. This was a brutal, vicious murder. And the coroner was able to examine the body sufficiently, particularly in the neck area, to see the signs of the violence which was inflicted on Gwen.
Police begin gathering additional evidence to try to work out a motive for the murder.
Crime scene techs and detectives arrive, and the first thing they're going to do is seal off that house to anybody. And then they're going to start collecting evidence, trace evidence, blood evidence, whatever. And you begin right away at that door and the glass that's broken. There could be fingerprints. Then you work your way into the house and you start looking for anything, fibers, hairs, blood, anything left behind by the killer. You go to the handles on the doors, you check for fingerprints. Then you go to the body. You begin to look at the body. And the body speaks, even though the body is dead.
The incident had already taken law enforcement officers by surprise.
Rapid City was not a high crime area for a number of rapes. And this was a time when fingerprints and blood typing were the main stays of a criminal investigation. They found several latent fingerprints in Gwen's house. However, they were able to determine most of them except one. They were not able to determine who that one mysterious fingerprint belonged to.
Police begin to learn more about Gwen Miller's background.
Gwen Miller was born in 1908, and, you know, she was a child of that era. And she grew into a student who was interested in pharmacology. So she followed that path during a time, really, when it was mostly male-dominated. So you could say that Gwen Miller really did what she wanted to do in life. Independent woman.
She was one of the sweetest women you'd ever want to meet. She was always happy to see you come, always pleasant to be around. And just a wonderful person.
Still remember just how happy Aunt Gwen was to see us. She was so happy to see her family members. And I think that's what I remember about Aunt Gwen, is she just always was happy to be with her family.
The news of Gwen's murder sends shockwaves through her family and the local community.
I got a phone call, and they told, her family just told me that Gwen had passed away. And that's all they ever said.
I just thought that she had died from diabetes. Nobody had talked any other, that anything else had happened. But this was the first funeral that I was allowed to attend, and I was a 5th grader. And then when I turned 28 and found out how Aunt Gwen died, after I got done being mad at my mother for never having told us that, I thought, oh no, now I understand. I totally understand why that church was so quiet.
An unassuming person who never bothered anybody, kept to herself. This is a home invasion, a murder, and a rape. It's rare, but it's scary.
The community was outraged. The police were at a loss. Who would decide to rape and murder Gwen Miller? Detectives knew they needed to find the killer before he struck again.
This investigation turns into 3 different agencies being involved: the sheriff's department, the local police, and the FBI. The local police detectives were the ones doing the gumshoe work.
A lot of this work is vital but basic police forensics.
Some of the main pieces of evidence that were collected were they dusted the house for fingerprints, which was one of the main investigative tools at their disposal at that time. They took many different fingerprints from different locations on the scene. They gathered up things like her purse, canceled check stubs. They gathered up the sheets from the bed. They took, of course, the night clothes that she had on. Those were taken at autopsy. They took the rug and so forth that had glass fragments and the pieces of the brick that was used to break the back window.
One of their biggest tools at the time was powder and a brush and taking fingerprints. So they get all sorts of fingerprints from Gwen Miller's house. And they're able to identify all of the fingerprints as Gwen's, her friends, family, except one set of prints. And that one set of prints, if I'm a detective, I'm saying that's my killer.
Police also canvassed the community, hoping to find any additional information about the murder.
The first thing they start doing is canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, talking to people. What have you seen tonight? They might be making calls to other departments to find out if there's any similar crimes in the area, but their main tool of investigation is talking to people. Then they're going to go to Gwen's work. They're going to talk there.
Gwen was a person of habit. This is something they looked at closely.
The police did their best to find out what happened to Gwen, how this murder took place. And there was a report that a taxi cab arrived at 10:30 p.m. that night, and that this was a female or maybe a male. They couldn't tell. The next door neighbor who made this report couldn't tell who got out of the taxi cab, and then the taxi cab drove away. It remained a mystery. The police investigated the best they could. They questioned every single taxi driver they could find. They gave them lie detector tests, the polygraph, and yet they could not find any indication that Gwen had taken a taxi cab.
More interviewees confirmed the sighting of the taxi.
One of the neighbors told the police at that time that she had just finished watching the evening news, which would have started at 10 and ended at 10:30, when she believed a taxi pulled up into Gwen's driveway. A subject that she could not describe, male or female, got out, and the taxi backed out and left. Based on the fact that Gwen didn't drive, that she took a taxi on a regular basis, the lady didn't think much of it, but that information in and of itself started a particular line of this investigation at that time.
And a name quickly emerges and rapidly becomes the chief suspect.
Neighbors throughout that area were quick to point out a gentleman that lived in Rapid City. His name was Michael Beckers. Michael Beckers was a pharmacist himself, and he owned Becker's Drug Store, which was downtown in the 600 block of Main Street in Rapid City.
Michael Beckers had his own pharmacy, and Gwen Miller worked part-time for him. So as they begin to look at this guy, they find out he's kind of a womanizer. You know, this guy, you know, he had his faults. But there was no indication that Gwen and him had any type of romance or anything going on. And there were no reports that maybe he had an obsession with her or anything like that. So as he begins to look like a good suspect, you know, now you're starting to exclude him. One report particularly begins to interest detectives about this guy. And that's that neighbors report he was out there one night. It was dark. He was loud. He was making a scene in front of Gwen's house. However, the guy liked drinking, so he was possibly drunk at the time. Now, if he's drunk and he's making a scene, that's one thing. If he's sober and he's making a scene, that's quite another thing.
The locals knew a good deal about Beckers.
Michael Beckers was known throughout our community to be a heavy drinker. He was a womanizer. He was separated from his wife and living with another woman, and he was reported to have gone to Gwen's house the summer prior to this murder. He showed up at night in a taxi. Because of his drinking, he also took taxis everywhere he went. He showed up at Gwen's house and was at her back door, beating and pounding on the door, demanding that she let him in, making so much noise that the neighbors called the police at that point in time, and the police responded and took him away from the property. So that, of course, made Michael Beckers a fairly decent suspect at that point in time.
Police asked Beckers to take a polygraph test.
The polygraph test is such an interesting police technique. The police love it, they want to use it, they will tell you how effective it is. The scientists will tell you that it is totally ineffective. But what real criminologists will tell you is that it is when the suspect refuses to take the polygraph that they are now fingered as someone who is involved in the crime. Becker refused to take the polygraph. He got scared. He didn't want to take it. But what the police will tell you is that if the suspect refuses to take that polygraphic examination, they have something to hide, because the layman doesn't know that the polygraph is unreliable. The layman thinks that, I'm going to be caught, and that's why they refuse. So when Becker refused, he made himself a prime suspect.
Michael Becker's current partner also suspects that he is behind the murder.
Many of the people in our community at that point in time believed Michael Beckers was the person that killed Gwen Miller. One of those people that came forth was the girlfriend that Michael Beckers was currently living with in an apartment near his pharmacy. One of her best friends, another female, was actually acquainted with one of the detectives that was working on this case. So Michael Becker's girlfriend says to her friend, "There is no doubt in my mind, Michael Beckers is the one that killed that lady." That detective and another detective tried to make contact with Michael Beckers's girlfriend to verify this statement. They met her at the apartment near the pharmacy, started to conduct an interview with her. We're just basically telling them who they were and why we're here and getting some of the basics down, when Michael Beckers burst into the apartment and basically threw the detectives out, demanded that they leave, you may not talk to her, those type things. Rather than cause a scene, those detectives just backed away calmly and so forth and went on about their day, of course noting the fact that Michael Beckers really didn't want us to talk to her. They assumed that at some point in time they could talk to her in the near future at a place where he may not interrupt.
But the interview was never to happen.
The unfortunate part to this whole thing is approximately a week later, that female died of what was put on her death certificate as a drug overdose. So they were never able to conduct the interview with her.
And the investigation into the murder of Gwen Miller suffers another setback, this time through an event beyond the control of the Rapid City Police.
There's boxes upon boxes of files, interviews, lie detector test results, analysis. And what happens is devastating to the investigation. In 1972, there's a flood in the office where the records are kept, and the records are destroyed. So literally, you're starting back at the beginning again. And, you know, this is before digital and all of that. So now you're banking on memory. Because, you know, in any investigation, you interview somebody and you want to go backwards and look at the case record, and maybe there's some information that lines up. They can't do that anymore.
The investigation hits another brick wall when Michael Beckers dies.
Michael Beckers died in 1973. This was one of the strange developments in the case of Gwen Miller, where the prime suspect was no longer alive. The police went on to look at this as a cold case. They didn't have a suspect. They didn't have anyone who they could pin this crime on, and they were at a total loss. This case was going to go unsolved, except for the fact that there was the development of DNA technology over the years, and except for the fact of one lone detective who decided, I ain't gonna let this thing go.
In Rapid City, South Dakota, it's 37 years since the brutal killing of Gwen Miller, whose body was found in her house on Hall Street in the city in February of 1968. The case has gone cold, and most people, including many detectives, have given up all hope of ever identifying her killer.
In 2005, the State Division of Criminal Investigation received a grant, I believe, from the federal government to look into and process some unsolved cases using new DNA technology that was coming about. One of the cases that they worked on at that point in time was Gwen Miller's case. The evidence was sent to the state crime lab. Semen samples from her pajamas were processed and DNA extracted.
So they submit that DNA into CODIS and all of the databases, and they don't get a hit. Now, is it disappointing? Yes. Is it expected? Yes. Because those databases are only good if an offender has committed another crime and his or her information, his DNA, is put into that base. So what you have is, you have an offender's profile, but that offender is not in the system.
But the investigators in Rapid City have the bit between their teeth and are determined to advance the investigation based around DNA evidence.
In 2010, the Division of Criminal Investigation again took another look at this case. Based on improvements in the DNA and their abilities to obtain a better profile, they looked at this case again.
They exhumed the body of Michael Beckers, their main suspect in the original investigation, in order to get DNA to work with.
They were able to reprocess some of the evidence and obtain a complete DNA profile of the suspect at that point in time, including all of the Y chromosome markers. They needed to be able to compare Michael Beckers' DNA with this full profile to determine if he was the suspect.
They exhume his body. They tested DNA, which is a sperm sample found on Gwen Miller's pajamas, against Michael Beckers' DNA, and it's not a match. He did not rape her.
With the case now looking unsolvable, Rapid City Police Department contact Wayne Keefe to come and investigate the case.
I got a message from the chief one day that asked me to come to his office, and I didn't know what he wanted, but I went up there, went to his office and sat down, and he wanted to know what I had planned for after retirement. And I told him at that point I had 2-3 things that were kind of kicking around, but nothing solid. And he asked if I would consider working on cold cases for the department. I jumped at that opportunity, told him absolutely I would like to do that. It was during that time when I reviewed Gwen Miller's case and formed several opinions about what could be done with that case.
This is a cold case. He started interviewing people just out of the desire to not let it go. He would interview people who were in the records as having known Gwen Miller, her employee friends, co-workers, people at the hospital, people on the street, and where she lived. He would just try to find something that would give him a clue, that would give him a break.
Part of that intensive review includes meeting Gwen's relatives.
So I'd arranged to meet Wayne in November of 2015, and that's when more information became available. And Wayne there were 10 cold cases in South Dakota, and Gwen's was the oldest at that time. Wayne was well into doing a lot of work, and I think one of the first things that he shared with us was just for that day and age, he was so proud of how they had handled those initial days, months, and the first year of Aunt Gwen's passing, because they had worked on it on a regular basis. They had done a lot of work. He was amazed at how much. And I tell you what, when I discovered that, it was heartwarming to know that there were people in that community that had worked that hard to try to find the right answer.
During that same visit, we met with a couple of the detectives and talked to them about it and answered a lot of questions, and they told us how many hours and hours and how many people had worked on this case already and still hadn't been able to solve it. So they were really hopeful that they'd be able to find the person that did it and bring it to a conclusion.
Despite the evidence obtained at Becker's grave, some of the original investigation team are still not convinced that Becker is innocent. Detective Keefe makes it a priority to clear Becker's name once and for all.
I realize how beneficial it is to be able to know, in Michael Becker's case, who all his family members are. Were there any family members close in this area that I could obtain a familial DNA sample from, a DNA sample from a family member that can be compared to the DNA from the grave of marked as Michael Becker's? I was able to find 3 different family members fairly close to his grave, and I traveled there 2 different times, visited with family members, explained who I was and why I was looking into this case, and just frankly, I asked them, would you be willing to volunteer a DNA sample for me? And all 3 of them did that.
Using familial DNA technology, Wayne Keefe was able to come to a conclusion.
I was effectively able to determine that Michael Becker's was cleared in this case as being a suspect using DNA as the means to do that clearance.
So now we have confirmation that he's not the guy. So we don't have to focus on him anymore. We move on to the next guy. And if he's not the guy, the next guy. And this is how it goes. You have the DNA sample. All you got to do is find the donor.
To pinpoint a possible suspect, Detective Keefe turns to forensic genealogy.
During the time of trying to determine all of who could be a suspect, it occurred to me that through doing my own genealogy work and submitting my own DNA to a major genealogy company in the field, that if I were able to match the suspect's DNA to one of these databases, there was no doubt in my mind I could at least come up with who his family members were.
The Rapid City Police Cold Case Unit now had a strategy. They had a DNA profile. All they needed was a match.
I did not know what it was, but Detective Keefe did. and it was clear he had done his research, so he was able to explain it very carefully and explain how or why this could lead to the resolution of this case.
Would that possibly be a way of determining who this perpetrator was? They had the DNA. It had been preserved through floods, through all kinds of lost records. They had it. Couldn't they use it?
Wayne Keefe manages to track down one of the foremost experts in this emerging science.
I came across a lady by the name of Colleen Fitzpatrick. She was a PhD that ran a company called Identifinders. I did a small amount of work on that and saw that she had already had some success with her method of searching these databases and coming up with a potential name for either a John Doe that somebody was trying to figure out who they were, or in my case, to figure out a name for matching the profile for my killer.
He sent me the string of numbers which represents that, and my job was to compare that profile to the genetic genealogy YSTR public online databases. And that's quite a job. You can't do it by hand because there's probably 250,000 profiles scattered all over the internet on various websites. Well, we have software that can do that comparison and mine that data for matches. So they gave me the Y profile, I put it into my software, and I came up with the name Field or Fields, and I handed that to Wayne.
With that information, although not a match, it was the best direction that I had. I went through and reviewed all of the reports again to see if I could come up with that last name. Nowhere in any of the reports that I had access to, which was basically the sheriff's office, nor any of the interviews that I had conducted, was that name mentioned at all. So I went back to the Rapid City Library, consulted all of the Pope directories that they had present, and I created a spreadsheet of each and every name from 1947 up through 1975, I believe it was, that had the name of Field. One of the things I was particularly focused on was any of the addresses that were on there that would have been close to Gwen's address on Hall Street. I wasn't able to come up with any that were right next door at that point in time. However, the closest address I could come up with was on West Rapid Street and belonged to a man by the name of Eugene Fields.
So who is Eugene Fields, and does he have any connection to Gwen Miller?
So over the next several months, I spent trying to figure out how or where Eugene Fields could be connected to Gwen Miller. His employment in these Pope directories was listed as maintenance and regional airport and Western Airlines and things such as that.
Detective Keith was relentless in trying to find out the background here. He interviewed 100 people and tracked down Field that he worked at the airport as a ticketing agency in Rapid City. He figured that when Gwen, who traveled all the time, would go to the airport, she was bound to have run into him. It was a small Rapid City airport. She would have seen him up close and personal. They would have met, they would have talked. He may have made advances to her. And he said maybe it was that he wanted to have a relationship with her and she rejected him. And he thought, aha, there is a potential motive. That is the likely motive, that this was a situation where he was angry, he had been rejected, and this was the motive for murder.
But I still wanted to figure out how to put him in the neighborhood. I was able to determine that a few years prior to the murder, 4 years or 5 years prior to the murder, Eugene rented a room and lived in the basement of the house right next door to Gwen, right next to the bedroom where Gwen was killed.
So they start to really dissect Eugene Fields' life. He was married twice. They talked to both of his ex-wives. And guess what? He was abusive, violent. Well, now we're building the profile of somebody who could have raped and murdered Gwen Miller.
And Wayne Keefe discovered something else about Fields.
Eugene Fields, for his occupation, drove a taxi.
But the team now runs into a major stumbling block.
So in order to find out if Eugene Fields was my suspect, I was going to need DNA from him. That was compounded by the fact that he died in 2009. So I investigated pretty much every possibility I could for where I could obtain DNA from him, except for having to exhume a grave, as was done with Michael Becker's.
With Eugene Fields being dead, investigators collect DNA from his brother to use for genealogy.
I did a great deal of investigation of the whereabouts of Eugene's brother, and I located him in an area in Colorado, and ultimately it came to the point where I just needed to ask him voluntarily for a DNA sample, a buccal swab, a swab of the inside of his mouth, to see if I could either confirm or ultimately deny that Eugene was the person that had raped and murdered Gwen Miller. And he willingly and gladly gave me that sample.
They tried to see if that was a match to the DNA that had been left at the crime scene. It wasn't. So the brother was not the perpetrator. But we found that the genealogy was an absolute correct match, where it narrowed down the likelihood of Fields being the actual perpetrator to 99.23% likelihood of him being the perpetrator. That's the kind of match they had. The detective got his man.
It was almost surreal in a lot of different ways. And just unbelievable that I was able to come up with that, because it took so long to do. I was so happy to be able to call Gwen's family and tell them what had happened.
I was sitting at my desk, and I work in an open area, so I had a cubicle, and I was working away, and my phone was ringing, and I just, nobody ever calls me at work. Oh, wait a second, this is Wayne. If he's calling, I'm taking this call. And I won't forget the tone of his voice, and it's hard to describe that tone of voice. It was a little tremulous. I think it was a little teary. And he said, "We've got a match."
A press conference is called where the Rapid City Police Department are able to share the findings of their investigation.
Very emotional to have all of the officials from the city and the Rapid City Police Department, the Sheriff's Department, some of the older detectives being there. It was very emotional.
I'm trying to think if I felt relieved or elated, or maybe a combination of both. It was just, it was just so nice to finally know who. And I've always said, it'd be great to know why.
This is a case that was, almost 50 years old at the time. And for us to be able, after all that time, to put it together and identify somebody as responsible, pretty amazing.
The police now knew that Eugene Fields had killed Gwen Miller half a century previously. They didn't know why, but they had achieved some element of closure for the family. The case is a validation for revolutionary new science and the work of the Bloodline Detectives.
Without genetic genealogy, just looking back at this case, and I know I've talked to Colleen Fitzpatrick many times. She is such a wonderful person. She minimizes her role in this case. But the simple fact of the matter is without her role in this case, it would not have been solved.
You know, knowing the family and knowing on this side of the story how much they appreciated it and how much that brought release to them. Now they know the answer. Now they know what happened. Now they can go on and take all that energy they were concentrating on, you know, wondering what happened. They can take that and let it go. They can take a deep breath and go on with their lives.
It's important for our family, but we've always looked at this as, this is not just about our family. This is about a dedicated, tenacious, professional detective who did this work, and hopefully other families are going to be able to benefit. So it's kind of that sense of, this is really great for our family, but it could be potentially even greater for more people. And we firmly believe that this was as important for all the other cold cases that people are reading about.